epicenter and the glue that's held Babbitt together through many transitions since 2001. And she's been the one consistent member of the organizing committee for the walk for 8 years, even though she says maybe we won't do it this year, but then we do, and look what happens. Sally is the memory of Babbitt, and we owe her a lot. So lower. Okay, thank you. Since Professor Cromer Learns to Read was published in February, I've had the opportunity to meet hundreds of fine folks around the country. But I'm most excited and most highly honored to be back here at Babbitt's and Heads Held High with all my friends. So thank you very much. Today I want to talk about sharing our stories to make big, powerful changes. Okay, writing the book was a way to share the story of Alan and I and what our life was like after his brain injury. I'll just tell you a tiny bit. Alan was a physics professor at Northeastern University for 35 years and had a massive heart attack that stopped his heart. He had a very severe brain injury from lack of oxygen and had to learn to read, write, walk, talk, think, remember all over again, as so many of you know. And he did regain his skills to varying degrees, but was never able to be a physics professor again. But I'll tell you what he did do as part of the talk. I had been a medical and psychiatric nurse for many years before that, and a psychotherapist, and we really took advantage of the opportunity to get involved in the community and to contribute to Babbitt's. And we got so much from being members of Babbitt's and made wonderful friends and learned a lot. But today I want to talk about all of us sharing our stories to make important changes. Every brain injury survivor here today has a very powerful story to share about your challenges and all of your accomplishments and your life now. And I know many do. Chuck Ozog writes poetry about this, and Tracy Tarver's just finished her book about brain injury. I think Tracy's here in the crowd. Is Tracy here? She's coming up from the Cape. But Tracy and I met several years ago in a writer's workshop down in Provincetown, each with the intention of writing a memoir. And it took us more years than we thought to get around to doing it, but now we both have books. So it's so important. We learn from each other, we learn about each other, and we learn from each other. Every family caregiver standing here today is the lead character in your loved one's survival story. And you have a book that you could also write about how the challenges that you've met and the ways you've grown and changed as a person and become an advocate. So every family member and family caregiver has a story to tell also. In Massachusetts, we have a very distinguished legacy of a personal story causing a profound and necessary change. It was 30 years ago this month that Marilyn Spivak and Dr. Martin Spivak founded the National Head Injury Foundation at their kitchen table. And that was because their daughter Debbie, where's Debbie? Is she here? She's here. Oh, she's late. All right, she'll be here. You'll know when Debbie arrives. You'll meet her. There were no specialized brain injury rehabilitation services 30 years ago. There were no state organizations to give people resources. So the Spivaks joined with Arlene Korab and Inter Hall and other outstanding families to form this grassroots organization that's now become the Brain Injury Association of America with chapters in 40 states. That all came about because of Debbie's story that spurred people to action. Every great political and social action movement starts with a powerful story that stirs a lot of people to action, but it all starts with just a few who know exactly what it's about. There have been tremendous advances in brain injury prevention and treatment and rehabilitation over the last 30 years. We all know that. However, our work is far from done. Have you heard? You just heard from John Auerbach that brain injury is on the rise in Massachusetts and across the country, from sports concussions, from falls, accidents, and now, unfortunately, from war-related injuries. Let me just go over a couple of the numbers, because they're so high, I often stop and think, can that be true? Can those numbers be true? Why don't we hear more about this? You'll see these posters as you're walking around the pond. Every year in the United States, 1.7 million people suffer some form of brain injury. 1.7. And that's mostly the traumatic brain injuries that they keep track of. There's many other kinds that aren't even tracked. Now that 1.7 million people is greater than the number of people who develop breast cancer, HIV/AIDS, multiple sclerosis, and spinal cord injury, all combined every year. More people have brain injuries, and yet federal funding for brain injury prevention and treatment is a teensy fraction of what it is for those other terrible diseases. So one of the battles we have to keep fighting is for equity in research monies and treatment. Over 3 million people live with the consequences of a traumatic brain injury across the country. And now an estimated 300,000 wounded servicemen and women from the Iraq and Afghani wars have some degree of brain injury. 300,000. This is going to change healthcare, lots of policies, education, life in our communities, because many of these wounded service members will need services, as will their families, for many, many years to come. Right here in Massachusetts, 44,000 people in Massachusetts sustain a traumatic brain injury every year. Isn't that a high number?
Wow.
So our work to prevent and treat brain injury and guarantee a life of quality, productivity, and inclusion for survivors and family members must remain an urgent battle. Our individual and collective presence here today gives fervent testimony to how far we've all come, but how far we still have left to go. Today, for the 8th year, we come to Heads Held High as a celebration, a reunion, and a public demonstration of our individual and collective strength and power. I'd like to invoke the legacy of my late husband, Alan Cromer. And this is a picture of Alan and I at the 2004 Heads Held High walk. Alan loved coming to the walk. Alan always enjoyed the celebration and the festivities here at Heads Held High. He bought plenty of raffle tickets for Doyle's and Sorellas so we could go out for breakfast. And he liked showing off his progress when he'd see his speech therapist and OT that he had known from Spalding when they came. And year after year, it's that very kind of reunion where the therapists get to say, wow, look how much further you went since I knew you were in the hospital, you know. So Alan always liked that aspect of it too. But most of all, Alan was moved and energized by meeting so many other families whose life had been shattered and rebuilt after brain injury. Alan shared his story of life after brain injury with survivors who were just starting rehabilitation to give them hope and motivation. And you do that too. Every time you share your story with someone who's a step behind you on this journey, you're giving them hope and inspiration and some practical tips. Alan spoke forcefully to community groups, schools, medical professionals, and our local politicians. That's the important part today. Together we wrote letters advocating changes for people with disabilities in public policies and votes. He campaigned for our representative, Liz Malia, by standing on Center Street for hours, holding the signs. And we can all do that at the polls and in advance, because she did vote the way we would on all the important issues. Every one of us has a powerful story to share, as Alan did, to raise awareness about brain injury. Your story can be a tool for change and a part of the system that impacts a service that you need very much or that you've benefited from and want other people to have. So your story is very important, especially this month. We have an important election coming up on November 2nd. There are some very important things you can do right now. I'm going to tell you 3 things you can do today before you leave the pond. The first is to go over to the Brain Injury Association of Massachusetts table and sign up for the Legislative Alert Action. And that way, when there's an issue coming up to be voted on or be considered, you can call your local legislators and tell them how you want them to vote on it. And the BIA will send you the information about that. Second, with the big election coming up on November 2nd, there's a lot at stake. The ballot questions, numbers 1, 2, and 3, all involve cutting taxes, well, right now, those taxes go to pay for services for mental health programs, affordable housing, and health and human services programs. So it's very important. You know, everybody likes the response of course we want to cut taxes, but wait, stop and ask first, how are those taxes being spent, and what programs will be eliminated if the taxes are cut? So call your local legislators and let them know where you stand on this, and when you go to the polls, vote no, no, no on 1, 2, and 3 on the ballot questions. All right?